Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's been a very, very busy weekend and a very busy day for politics. And last week was really a make or break week for South Africa, with obviously Cyril Ramaphosa having his big powwow with Donald Trump. Now, this week, we obviously have some developments on that front, and some of them are actually very important to discuss. But before we do, can I yet again remind you, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. It really does help. Has helped grow those numbers. So let's actually start off from the top and work our way through it. And that is that the legacy media have come to the aid of Cyril Ramaphosa to effectively say that actually Cyril was picked on. He was met with forms of misinformation. Everything that Donald Trump had come to show him were lies and fabrication. And that effectively Cyril's ability to sit there and, well, say nothing served him very well, because he came across as the statesmanly person, whilst Donald Trump came across as the villain, I suppose. But more bizarre is actually the reaction that Julius Malema has actually had to the entire event, with Julius Malema suggesting that actually he was the life of the party. He says that he turned the Oval Office into a cinema, and that despite only being a 9.2% party, this showed that actually the EFF was still a dominant force in South African politics. Now, interesting enough, he then further went on to say, actually, the EFF were the only political party that had ever been able to fill the FNB stadium with 100,000 people who had gone there to, well, have their little rally. And you will recall that. That's Juju's famous forklift picture that he loved to show everybody, where he painted the stadium red and saying, "Kill the Boer." But you see, the problem that Julius is neglecting to say is that currently there are by-elections going on around the country at numerous places, and the EFF has yet to win any of them. In fact, in many places, the EFF are getting single-digit votes. They are no longer a political force. And so what Julius is effectively trying to do is to suggest that he is still politically relevant, even though he's politically not. Now, he was asked at the event what he thought of the entire thing. And he says that basically Donald Trump had asked, why is he not in jail? Why is this man not arrested? Why is this man not dead? Well, actually, I'm sorry, Juju. He didn't say, why is this man not dead? And he didn't say the follow-on line, which Juju alleged he did, which is, why are you not killing this man who wants to kill white people? Trump didn't say that, dude. Maybe whilst you were allegedly taking some of your coke, like, you heard that, but he didn't say that. That is definitely not what he says. And so Juju says that actually he's not going to be silenced by threats of violence, and he's not going to be silenced by threats of death. And he says, as a revolutionary, the idea that they'll be killed is an honor. It's an honor they wear with pride. And Curtis say, dude, you're smoking some Zool. He didn't suggest that you should be killed. He said, why are you not arrested? Because in his country, if you called for the death of the people, you'd be arrested for incitement of violence. Pretty much the same for the UK. Talking of the UK, the Telegraph in the UK came out in defense of Ramaphosa, because what you'll notice is that the legacy media have come out in defense of Ramaphosa. And they effectively suggested that Donald Trump ambushed Cyril Ramaphosa with all sorts of fake information. And the reason this becomes really interesting is that whilst they're saying this, Donald Trump is sending a free speech team to interview UK activists on the basis that activists in the UK who are centre-right or even on the right of the spectrum are being arrested by the UK government on the basis of hate speech, and there is no freedom of speech there, because freedom of speech have been locked up in line with hate speech legislation. And so it's very curious that Donald Trump says the media in the UK is left-wing leaning, and that is all basically fake news. Now, you see, the interesting idea behind this is that we're constantly being told that there are no farm murders. And as I said in my video on Friday, you can't say that. You cannot say that there are no farm murders, because there are. You can argue whether or not they were race-based. You could argue whether they amount to a genocide. But you can't claim that there is no farm murders. And you can't claim that some of those murders aren't for the sole reason that A, they're white, and B, they own land. Now, the arguments often put forward by people like Julius is that the only reason that this occurs is because give us back their land. We want land redistribution. And Ernest Roots actually had some interesting observations about this, which you can watch here.
These land activists do not seem to be able to differentiate between the idea of restitution and the idea of redistribution, which is fundamentally different. So restitution says you need to correct an injustice. There was a wrongdoing and we need to fix that. And I think any reasonable person should support that. If there was a community that was chased off their land, they should get their land back as a matter of principle. Redistribution is something else. What redistribution means today is look at whoever is the owner of a piece of land. If the person who owns the land is white, that is a problem. If the person who owns the land is black, that's a good thing. But that doesn't recognize that you can be the owner of a piece of land and be a white person and have acquired that piece of land through legitimate means. What makes it complicated today is there were land injustices. There were injustices in terms of how patterns of land ownership developed. And there were certainly black communities that were dispossessed of their land. That then is interpreted today as every black person that lives in South Africa was dispossessed, and every white person that lives in South Africa was involved with these dispossessions. And so every white person that owns land, there should be a question mark upon that person, or that ownership is illegitimate. And every black person that doesn't own land, that's because some white person took your land. And it's more complicated than that. Dealing with history through political solutions is very difficult because you lose nuance, and issue becomes narrowed down to a question of populism, and whichever politician is able to be the most populist, to scream the loudest, to be the most controversial in presenting the argument, eventually wins the argument. Not necessarily because they win on the facts, but because they win on the politics of the argument. And I think this has led to a place where the whole debate about land ownership has become so warped in South Africa that it's very difficult to sort of find your way through and sort of come out on the other side and still be sane.
Now, another thing that's happened as a result of the whole powwow is that the DA and Johan Rupert are at each other's throats, specifically over the claim that Johan said when in the Oval Office that actually one of the highest crime rates that occurred in the country was actually in the Cape Flats. And that was John Steenhuisen's province, and he didn't want to talk about that because he was a DA guy. The DA came out and said this is a misleading claim because the DA does not control the police in the Western Cape. And so they have no police powers. In fact, the DA have frequently asked for provincial powers and policing powers so that they can tackle the crime rates, they say. Now, they haven't been granted that by national government, and they're being held responsible for the crime rates that they cannot affect. So they're saying that's unfair. And Johan Rupert knew this. And so they're saying that his claim was basically false. Now, if you watch my video on Friday, you'll notice that one of the key adjustments being made is actually around the BEE legislation. This specifically comes in relation to the RCT sector. Now, this amendment to the RCT sector has been suggested that it was being done for, well, Elon Musk, so that Elon Musk can have Starlink in South Africa. And it appears to be one of the concessions being made to the Trump administration. But you see, why this becomes really interesting is that the South African government came in and basically said, no, this wasn't being done for Elon Musk, and that what they were attempting to do is to allow the BEE exemptions to be adopted in relation to Starlink. But according to them, this was nothing new. Now, I must be honest and say I've listened to this argument many times, and I don't really 100% understand the rationality of the argument. So I looked it up, and I'm going to tell you exactly what they're talking about. And this actually comes on the back of what's called the Broad-Based Black Economic Empowerment Act 53 of 2003, and specifically Statement 103 of the BBBEE Codes of Good Practice, which basically mean that you can have what's called an equity equivalent program. Now, this specific program allows for an alternative ownership compliance mechanism designed for wholly foreign-owned multinationals. So if you're a wholly foreign-owned multinational, you can basically rely on this exemption to have an alternative BE structure. You don't just have to say, okay, it's just going to go to a black individual. You can use an alternative scorecard in order to satisfy your BBBEE equivalent, or effectively your alternative structure, right? So what do those look like? Well, they could look like skill development programs or supplier developments or critical infrastructure developments and so forth. And these type of things have been granted to a number of multinational organizations, specifically IBM, Amazon, Microsoft, and so forth. Now, why this is interesting is that specific thing relates to the ownership structures. But Starlink isn't worried about the ownership structures. What they're worried about is the licensing criteria. Because according to the licensing criteria as set out in Section 9.2.b of the Electronic Communications Act 36 of 2005, any individual who wants to have an economic communications license needs to have a minimum 30% ownership by persons who are historically disadvantaged. And there is no alternative. It just needs to be a person. So whilst on the ownership structures, they could come up with an equivalent or this alternative mechanism, also known as a EEP, they can't do that for the licensing criteria. And so when the government actually says, well, what they're attempting to do is they're using the existing exemption, no, they're not, because the exemption currently doesn't apply to the licensing criteria. And we see many such circumstances of this right across the board. The alternative or equivalencies don't exist in many industries. Now, this obviously met with a lot of fake news with individuals suggesting that the only reason that this was happening is because Starlink made demands. And it's curious how all these individuals will basically, propagate all these things that they feel that Starlink wanted. And they're all fake news. Now, what actually Starlink wanted was to be able to grant a license without having to fulfill the 30% criteria. Because as we've heard in the past, there's no point in establishing the company if you can't get the license, but you have to have the 30% giveaway on the license, which they can't do underneath the ownership structure. So you can see why this becomes a problem. Now, we all know that BEE is killing the economy and to a large degree needs to be ditched. It is at the moment one of the bedrocks, one of the key issues that are destroying the economy. But it is important to recognize that the reason it's killing the economy isn't actually in relation to the ownership structures. It's actually related to the licensing criteria, as Elon has seen. And many individuals don't understand that. They think that, as we're suggesting now, you just create this alternative structure and you're fine. You just get a front and you're fine. Well, it's not that straightforward where it comes to licensing. So any sector that requires licensing is highly problematic. Now, when actually looking at the gazetted rules, what the gazetted rules appear to do is actually adopt one of these EEPs, these exemptions for the licensing criteria, which means that you could create this alternative equivalence, whether it be a skill program or key infrastructure development or whatever those be. You've got this alternative program which you could then use to satisfy the 30% criteria according to the licensing criteria. Now, that is new. Now, the government, the reason they don't want to say that this is new, and it is to a large degree a watering down of BE, is because their own stooges have become so wedded to the BE idea that already they're giving forms of backlash against the ANC, saying, you can't do that, this is outrageous. With the ANC's own members, their heads of communication panels wanting to bring their minister to account and saying, you can't do this, this is like unconstitutional. They actually said unconstitutional. Yes, so BE is now constitutional in the licensing criteria where it bars others from ownership structures. You can't make this up. You couldn't make this up if you tried. In any case, where are we currently with the AGOA? Well, the latest news today is that South Africa has tabled a proposal that we will buy US gas if they offer us duty-free access of up to 40,000 local vehicles annually, which we can export to the US. Now, the idea that AGOA may or may not be renewed is an ongoing discussion with numerous things currently in play. And one of the things that were discussed during the Trump meeting was basically what the US wants from South Africa. And it's important to understand that what the US actually wants from South Africa is nothing, insofar as it doesn't want to care about our rights or our PE criteria. The only thing they care about is their trade. So let's use the example of BE. The Trump administration said very clearly that they had an issue with BE, but they also made it very clear that they only had an issue with it insofar as American companies cannot invest in South Africa and they cannot do business here because of things like the BE licensing criteria. Did they care that you or me as members of the state, that we might be affected by it? And the answer is no. They actually only cared about American trade. And to a large degree, that's the way it should be. I mean, they should only care about their own trade. But if you're looking at Trump to be some kind of like savior that's going to change things in South Africa, look, I think he will change things in South Africa, but only as a consequence of looking after his own interests, because it's clear that he hasn't really pushed our interests. He's pushed Americans' interests. And that's a really important thing to understand. And so that's currently where we are. We currently don't really know a lot more than that. In terms of AGOA, it's been referred to the Senate. The Senate will review it. There are still individuals in the Senate that want South Africa kicked out of AGOA. But there does appear to be a willingness by the Trump administration to negotiate new tariffs and trade deals with South Africa. And if South Africa gives the Trump administration a lot of what they want, then the reality is AGOA probably will get renewed. So what's happening in terms of the whole refugee program? The answer at this point in time is no one knows. If you watch my videos, you would have noticed that I noticed when the Trump administration issued their actual guidelines that they dropped the idea of Afrikaners and they went through to minorities, which, as I said at the time, meant that the program could include Indians and whites and whoever else. But the reality is nothing further has happened along that. The legacy media is now caught on to the idea that the actual wording had been expanded. But will there be another trough of individuals going to the US? Well, that really does remain to be seen. Very curiously, actually, where I live, even in PE, one of the individuals was spotted that went there with her family is actually from Lorraine. Now, if you know Lorraine, it's actually a really peaceful area. Nothing really happens there. It's actually a really nice neighborhood, like really nice. And her house has been put on the market now at 2.3 million. Now, she herself isn't even Afrikaans. She's English. And she lived in actually a pretty good state with no threats of violence and nothing ever having happened to her. So now what? And things like this are being highlighted to the Trump administration, which does suggest the Trump administration may actually ramp up their vetting of the individuals going. Will they actually do so, though? I don't know. But stories like this at the moment are all over the press and they're all over the US. And there's a lot of pushback against Trump for his adoption of the refugees from South Africa. So who knows what's happening? It's all gone quiet. And will Trump reverse his rules? Remains to be seen. I don't know. But I'll keep you updated as I know. Anyway, these are all just my views. Do let me know what you think in the comment section below. Until tomorrow, bye.
Elon, let's start with this. You're the richest man in the world. You own a major social media platform. You're influencing space, AI, energy, and now even politics. Do you think it's healthy or even democratic for one unelected billionaire to have this much power over public discourse and global infrastructure?
Power? Done. I built things people choose to use. No one elected me, and no one's forced to buy a Tesla, use X, or launch a satellite with SpaceX. That's called the free market. The real problem is when unelected journalists push narratives without accountability, shaping minds with zero innovation, zero risk, and zero skin in the game. So if you're worried about power with no checks, maybe look in the mirror.